free black slaves and their sympathizers were pushed away when black people became more and more afraid to vote because it could cost them their lives, the work of the Klan was essentially done.
White Southerners are managing to get back legitimate power. Once they control the sheriff's office, the trial justices, once they are in charge of those things, they don't need the Klan anymore. And in fact, if you have legitimate power, you really don't like a bunch of young men running around deciding to attack people. You don't want to have to deal with whatever their priorities are. You want to be in charge.
In 1877, the Federal Army pulled out of the South with mixed results. The end of slavery was meant to give way to a regime of equality. Instead, it was slowly replaced with segregation, which lasted nearly a century. Blacks and whites wouldn't mix in daily life. Schools, shops, transportation, hospitals, and more were all affected. African Americans would be separated from the white population, which kept all the power. Black people remained second-class citizens. The values of the Klan's invisible empire had spread amongst the general population. Lynchings of African Americans became more common. The federal government turned a blind eye.
As I've stated in the previous videos in this series, white society is inherently evil, especially towards us. And the KKK were just an outward expression of what their culture truly is: evil and full of hatred. The U.S. Supreme Court does not actually have the right to override actions by the U.S. Congress in black civil rights matters or other provisions intended by Congress to protect vulnerable and impoverished black ex-slaves. The U.S. Constitution defines the task of the U.S. Supreme Court as threefold. 1. To decide appeals from trials held in lower courts. 2. To get involved in the appointment of ambassadors. And finally, 3. To rule in cases in which a federal official failed to carry out his duties. Nowhere does the U.S. Constitution authorize the Supreme Court to overrule or second-guess Congress or to act as a third level of government. Congress passed laws regarding slavery, the former slaves, and race. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has been rendering decisions on race mostly anti-black for centuries. The court invented its authority to overrule the U.S. Congress over 200 years ago. Surprisingly, there have not been any legal challenges to the court's assumed authority in race matters. The first time the court assumed authority to rule on acts of Congress was in the year 1803 in Marbury versus Madison. In this landmark case, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled a law passed by Congress and declared it unconstitutional. Since then, the court has bolstered its power by promoting itself as the supreme law of the land. In the democracy of the U.S., the Supreme Court was allowed to become an unelected third branch of the government, a body of life-tenured, biased individuals who made no pretense of neutrality in race or political matters. A few prominent personalities of that day did take issue with and questioned the court's right to assume overriding authority, but the effort eventually waned. The court and its authority came under scrutiny 50 years later when Chief Justice Roger Taney and his fellow jurists, all white, wealthy slaveholders and supporters of slavery, issued their infamous 1857 Dred Scott decision, just 3 years before the beginning of the American Civil War. The legal issue was over Dred Scott, a slave who claimed that he was free because he had traveled to a free state. The U.S. Supreme Court slaveholders ruled, quote, "A black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect," end quote. Further, the court restated the sentiment of the Constitution, that black people were property equal to field animals, and as property, the owner of the property held the rights, not the black man. Even though the court professed to be objective, fair, and honorable, how could slaveholding jurors make a just decision? Although the conflict of interest of the justices was clear and their decision not neutral, the Supreme Court was within the parameters of the law because at the time, nothing within the Constitution gave rights to black people. The Supreme Court, as the self-appointed guardian of the racial status quo and champion of white superiority, went on the offensive and crossed over the line. Before the Civil War, the Constitution gave no rights to blacks, and the court did not have authority to overrule Congress in issues related to the black race. However, in the mid-1860s, following the Civil War, radical Republicans had sufficient political power to enact 3 constitutional amendments and civil rights laws to give blacks rights and to reverse the Dred Scott decision. At this point, radical Republicans were too strong for the Supreme Court. However, a decade later, in the mid-1870s, the court assumed authority and ended the Reconstruction period by ruling that all the civil rights laws that the Congress enacted for blacks in the 1870s were unconstitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court ended Civil War Reconstruction and laid the foundation for the re-enslavement of black people. With the southern states needing blacks in peonage and semi-slavery, and the North not wanting black ex-slaves to migrate into the North, there was no resistance to the court fully establishing itself as a co-equal branch of the federal government along with the executive and congressional branches. The Supreme Court continued expanding and exercising powers in race matters in the first Reconstruction period of the 1870s. The court's members had been guardians of white superiority appointed to maintain the social and economic privileges of the white race. Supreme Court jurors for the first 100 years were slaveholders. For the second 100 years, with very few exceptions, they were white males who protected the white race. The Supreme Court's declaration that the federal government had no enforcement powers for equal treatment of blacks opened the floodgates to a torrent of racial exploitation and abuse. 200 years ago, the actions of the Supreme Court may not have been authorized, but they dug a deep hole from which black Americans will always have to fight to escape.
Photos from lynchings would be sold and used as postcards. There would be souvenirs from these sorts of events. People would want to take pictures in front of someone who was victimized in a lynching. So these are acts that involved, directly or indirectly, tacitly, broad swaths of the white population.
Lynchings often went far beyond the stereotype of simply hangings. People may be shot, they could be burned alive, they would be tied to the back of automobiles by the time we get to the 20th century and dragged through the streets and then have their body displayed publicly.
And what you often had in some of these lynchings was the actual molestation of the body of the lynched person. They, to be crude about it, one of the things they loved to do would be to cut off a man's penis and stick it in his mouth. Some of that was so sexualized that there also might seem to be some kind of white anxiety about black sexuality.
It was a ritual that was meant to publicly demonstrate to both blacks who heard the stories and whites who witnessed the crime that racial domination was something that would be enforced within society. So it was a cultural process. It was a performance, a very macabre performance, as much as it was a kind of attempt to take legal matters into the hands of vigilantes. And in that sense, it meant to organize society in the same sort of way that a book or a speech or a sermon at church is meant to tell you what your values are.
About race and racism. I just happen to be sitting next to Mr. Metzger. And so during a commercial break, I kind of touched him on his arm. I'm sitting right next to him. And he didn't say, "Don't touch me, nigger." I said, "Mr. Metzger, tell me something. What percentage of people who classify themselves as white are fearful of white genetic annihilation?" And he answered very politely. He said, "Dr. Welsing, nearly all of them. But they are ashamed or afraid to admit it." Now, I can understand that. In other words, this system is about white genetic survival. Now, if some people have organized a system for their genetic survival, what's the chance that they're going to give that system up? None. See, they worked hard. And we can consider it unjust. It's the most unjust system that has ever been devised on the planet, where you have 1/10 of the people deciding that they need to control 9/10 of the people on the planet.
Black Americans are most definitely more vulnerable to terrorism than other Americans. Terrorism is rooted in human psychological pathology that seeks to intimidate, injure, and control other humans based upon the religious, political, or racist ideologies of the terrorists. 5 centuries of institutionalized enslavement, Jim Crow segregation, and benign neglect have made Black Americans a favorite target of conservative terrorists, hate mongers, and religious zealots. Blacks are the most identifiable and vulnerable population group in America because they are totally dependent upon non-Black racial and ethnic groups for their safety and daily needs. Just as they are unprepared to protect themselves in the case of civil unrest or natural disasters, it will be even more difficult for Black Americans to protect themselves from institutional-based, cultural-driven terrorism because they live in culturalist, porous, dysfunctional neighborhoods instead of close-knit, functional Black communities. Blacks lack a defensive code of conduct. The definition of a functional community is a physical community that has a culture and code that supports an alternate and semi-independent economy that produces services, goods, jobs, and has a tax base for its residents. In a functional community, people are familiar with each other and have common needs and interests. It is where they store and secure their wealth, power, businesses, heritage, jobs, products, and other resources. A functional community has an identity and an operational network of obligations between its members and socio-economic enterprises. To successfully protect its members, a community must have a physical location and infrastructure that can be marked and closed if necessary against outsiders who might pose danger. Members who live outside the physical community can still identify with it by having a broad sense of community and sharing the common history, needs, interests, and goals, and the responsibility to protect and support the physical community and its members. The bane of the vulnerability of blacks to modern terrorism results from their not having functional communities. Blacks were still complicit in white society's destruction of the black communities that did exist until the 1960s. Now blacks have surrendered their community resources, sense of community, and collective ability to protect themselves from outside, competitive, and hostile groups that can and have historically terrorized them. In most instances, black neighborhoods lack organizational institutions, local communication systems, surplus food, water, energy, and medical systems. The integration process diluted or removed experienced black leadership from black neighborhoods, leaving those left behind unprepared to deal with terrorists or other life-threatening crises. Just like the Ku Klux Klan symbols and marches, the primary goal of terrorism is to create fear and confusion, horrendous enough to disrupt social economic systems, paralyze citizens, and inhibit the flow of needed daily resources. Terrorists are unlike a classic stand-in army. They do not wear uniforms or bear standardized flags. They are advantaged by being unknown and invisible. They pledge their total allegiance and lives to a political ideology or religion, and most importantly, they do not actually exist until after they have committed a terrorist act. If they are successful in committing an act of terror, the media becomes complicit by promoting the successful act, which publicizes the cause of the terrorists and demonstrates their ability to achieve their objectives. They are not interested in how they are labeled or what consequences befall them. Terrorism functions best in open societies where people have many freedoms and their movements and activities are not under suspicion. Terrorists thrive on publicity and seek the notoriety of public identification. Although episodes of terrorism are newsworthy events, extensive media coverage sets the stage for even more terrorist acts of violence. Again, just like blacks have been impotent against the Ku Klux Klan and other forms of white terrorism, the United States of America itself is totally ill-prepared to fight, let alone win, a holy war or a terrorist-waged virtual war. Our government leaders promote the belief that America is the world superpower, a world police force that has politically obligated itself to be the moral conscience of the world. Our response to terrorism as a nation is anemic, illogical, and ignores what is known about the true nature of international terrorism. Black America is even more defenseless and vulnerable than the larger society that has organized institutions and resources. There is no interest nor any incentives for other ethnic or classes of groups to take care of the needs of black people. There is also no visible evidence that blacks have made preparations to protect themselves. The electrical blackout of 2003, which impacted the entire northeast region of the United States, sent messages to blacks that other groups felt no obligation to share their resources with blacks during a major crisis. In the Detroit area, for example, many white and ethnic suburban communities did not permit blacks from the city to enter for food, gas, or other essentials. Blacks must have their own backup resources. Whether in a dependent black neighborhood or socially scattered guests in white communities, they must have protection and the daily necessities of life in emergencies. When terrorism, man-made or natural disasters strike, it will be very difficult, if not too late, for blacks to gain access to vital resources such as doctors, hospitals, and grocery stores. Black elected officials, civil rights organizations, churches, and educational centers should take major responsibility to alert, organize, and prepare black communities to deal with terrorism in any form because Black Americans are a vulnerable outgroup. Black leaders and activists unilaterally expressed opposition to the nation's open-door policy on immigration throughout the 19th century. These conscious Black leaders expressed concern that immigrants were reinforcing the subordination of the native Black population, as well as usurping the access of Blacks to rights, privileges, employment, education, and wealth-building opportunities. Sounds familiar. The negative impact of immigrants worsened after the Civil War when millions entered the country. After slavery, there was a labor shortage, and one would have logically expected the former slaves, who had been skilled tradesmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, cooks, artisans, and farmers, to fill those jobs. But the country recruited and imported European immigrants instead. The pattern was just the beginning. For more than a century, Black leaders had struggled and challenged the white power structure to close the nation's immigration doors. In his famous 1895 Atlanta Exposition speech, Booker T. Washington pleaded with white industrialists, businessmen, and politicians not to look to European immigrants to develop skills and work in their businesses, but to look instead to native Blacks. Washington pointed out that many already had the skills, attitudes, and experiences to meld into the mainstream society. W.E.B. Du Bois was against immigration and spoke frequently about the downside for Blacks of 40 million white immigrants coming into the country, doing the jobs of former slaves, and being automatically elevated into an overseeing white management class. When the Black Civil Rights Movement commenced in the late 1950s, the new Black leadership dismissed or ignored the opinions of their predecessors. This is very important. Listen, one can only speculate as to the reasons. Perhaps they did not have the foresight to fully understand the politics of displacement that was occurring, were unknowledgeable about the nation's immigration history, wanted to demonstrate altruism, or they simply preferred to ignore or forget history and go along to get along as much as they could. Whatever the reasons, the new Black leadership switched from the anti-immigration stance of their predecessors to pro-immigration. While the reason for the change in the position is not clear, it is clear that they made a switch without fully understanding that providing unearned rights and benefits to immigrants chasing the American dream caused Native Black Americans to be neglected, disadvantaged, and rendered invisible in all respects. The old Black anti-immigration fighters must be turning in their graves, and they must be spinning on their heads right now, because we're literally, this is my emphasis, we are literally reliving what happened over 100 years ago, again, right now in 2023. Amazing how we have not learned anything from the past. Continuing. Throughout the history of North America, waves of immigrants have entered the country to take advantage of the considerable economic opportunities extended to them and to enjoy the elevated status, respect, and privileges they automatically receive over Blacks in the labor force. Since the Black descendants of slaves are not immigrants, they are excluded from the privileged status, benefits, and rights extended to immigrants and must compete with every immigrant for basic rights and life resources. Immigrants and Blacks compete for space, rights, economics, and privilege. Reaching America has been a dream come true for immigrants, but it has been a nightmare for many Native Blacks and their forefathers. Facts.
At the beginning of the 20th century, a new world was taking shape. Vertical cities emerged, and America became a country of immigration. Millions of Europeans, Catholics from the South, Jews from the East, disembarked for the world's leading industrial powerhouse and the promise of a better future. The Klan had fallen into obscurity. 50 years after the Civil War, it was born again from its ashes. In February 1915, The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith came out. The film was an adaptation of a successful play called The Klansman. A long feature film, it looked back at the Civil War and the Reconstruction. Griffith was an innovator. There were wide shots of battle scenes, realistic decor, and swelling music. The Birth of a Nation was a major cinematic show that broke with the silly, homemade skits that were typical of early cinematography. In the second half of the film, Griffith depicted scenes from the post-war era. Klansmen were shown not as criminals, but as justice doers.
Scholars of film look at it as very innovative and progressive in terms of its use of lighting, use of actors, and so on. But the core of this was the understanding that in the movie that these black men are really threatening to kidnap and rape white women all over the place. And the culmination, or the denouement of the film, is quite terrifying because it shows all these black people who are like barbarians, savages, just running wild across the land. And the brave Ku Klux Klanners are defending morality and white womanhood. And that position about defending white womanhood is very, very central to the Southern Klan.
It presented the Ku Klux Klan romantically. It presented the Ku Klux Klan as justified. All of this means that someone has to ride, literally, in on a white horse and not only restore order, but restore honor.
And this is very important in terms of why people were attracted, because for a certain kind of men, it made you feel good. You were kind of heroic and a super patriot doing something to protect your society and country.
The righters of wrongs in the Klan did their version of justice, and the audiences wanted more. The film roused new curiosity for the Ku Klux Klan. One man in particular took advantage of it: William Joseph Simmons.